Claire Holloway had barely finished saying "I do" when her phone vibrated inside the folds of her wedding dress. At first, she ignored it. Outside the stained glass windows of St. Augustine Cathedral, church bells rang across downtown Boston, while guests gathered beneath white rose arches, waiting for the bride and groom to emerge. Laughter echoed through the marble halls. Somewhere nearby, a violin quartet had already begun playing the reception music. Everything was perfect until her phone buzzed again and again. Frowning slightly, Claire stepped away from the bridal party and pulled the phone from the satin pocket sewn discreetly into her gown. One text message waited on the screen. Her stomach tightened the moment she saw the sender's name. Brandon Mercer, her boss's son, her direct supervisor, the man who had spent the last 3 months turning her dream job into a daily nightmare. Claire opened the message. "You're fired. Consider it my wedding gift to you." For a second, she forgot how to breathe. The bouquet nearly slipped from her fingers. 2 years. 2 years of 16-hour workdays. 2 years of skipped holidays and sleepless nights. 2 years spent building Northbridge Urban Design into the most efficient architecture firm in Boston. Gone. Just like that. And on her wedding day, a wave of humiliation crashed over her so hard she thought she might collapse right there in the cathedral hallway. "Claire?" Ethan Brooks appeared beside her, still wearing the soft smile he'd carried since the ceremony ended minutes earlier. But the moment he saw her face, the smile faded. "What happened?" Silently, Claire handed him the phone. She expected anger, shock, outrage. Instead, Ethan read the message and smiled. Not happily, knowingly. His calm reaction confused her more than the text itself. "Aren't you going to say something?" she whispered. Ethan gently took her trembling hand and kissed her knuckles. "Later," he said quietly. "Today belongs to us." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "I just lost my job." "No," Ethan replied softly. "Brandon just made the biggest mistake of his life." Before she could ask what he meant, Olivia Bennett, her maid of honor, called from the cathedral entrance. "They're waiting for you two." Guests outside began cheering loudly. Rose petals filled the air beyond the doors. And somehow, despite the panic clawing inside her chest, Claire allowed Ethan to guide her forward into the sunlight. For the next 3 hours, she forced herself to smile through photographs, speeches, champagne toasts, and dancing. But during their first dance, Olivia suddenly rushed toward them, holding Claire's phone with wide eyes. "Claire, your phone won't stop ringing." Claire glanced down at the screen. 214 missed calls. Most came from coworkers, several from executives. But 17 were from one person alone. Richard Mercer, founder of Northbridge Urban Design, Brandon's father. Her pulse quickened. With shaking fingers, Claire opened the latest voicemail. Richard's voice sounded frantic. "Claire, please call me immediately. Brandon had no authority to fire you. The Harborfront files are inaccessible. Nobody can operate your system. We're completely shut down." Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward Ethan and finally understood why he'd smiled. Brandon Mercer hadn't destroyed her career. He had just handed her the power to destroy his entire empire. Long before Brandon Mercer fired her by text message on her wedding day, Claire Holloway had already become the most important person inside Northbridge Urban Design. Most employees simply didn't realize it yet. Claire never came from wealth or influence. She grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Boston, where success meant paying bills on time and keeping promises, even when life became difficult. Her father taught high school history. Her mother worked at the public library. They weren't glamorous people, but they believed deeply in discipline, structure, and responsibility. Claire inherited all three. By the age of 12, she color-coded school binders for fun. By 16, She managed her parents' finances on spreadsheets more detailed than most accountants used. Organization wasn't just a habit for her. It was how she controlled chaos. Then chaos arrived anyway. During Claire's second year studying architectural project management at Northeastern University, her father suffered a massive stroke that left the family drowning in medical debt. Claire nearly dropped out of school to help support them. Instead, she worked nights at a printing warehouse while carrying a double course load during the day. Sleep became optional. Perfection became survival. When she graduated with honors 4 years later, Northbridge Urban Design hired her almost immediately. Richard Mercer himself interviewed her personally after reviewing one of her university system design projects. "You think like an architect," he'd told her during the interview, "but you organize like an engineer." That combination changed everything. At Northbridge, Claire quickly realized the company's biggest weakness wasn't creativity, it was coordination. Files disappeared constantly. Contractors worked from outdated blueprints. Budget revisions got lost between departments. Permit submissions were delayed because nobody tracked engineering approvals properly. The company looked polished from the outside. Inside, it was organized chaos. So Claire built something nobody asked for: a complete digital operational system. Every permit, every contractor revision, every blueprint version, every engineering signature, every city inspection, all interconnected. At first, executives ignored it. Then, deadlines started shrinking. Project delays dropped nearly 40% within 6 months. Clients became happier. Contractors stopped blaming each other for mistakes. Entire projects moved faster because Claire's system eliminated confusion before it spread. Richard Mercer quickly recognized what she'd created. Brandon Mercer did too, and that was exactly the problem. Brandon had recently been promoted to department director after Richard announced partial retirement. Officially, Brandon was supposed to modernize Northbridge for the future. Instead, he became obsessed with Claire. Not romantically, competitively. Employees trusted her more. Executives consulted her more. Even Richard relied on her judgment during major meetings. Brandon hated every second of it. At first, his resentment appeared small, interrupting her during presentations, taking credit for workflow improvements, leaving her out of executive discussions. But over time, the behavior escalated, especially after Claire began organizing company-wide training sessions to teach department heads how to use the operational system properly. Brandon canceled every single session. "Waste of money," he'd say casually. But Claire noticed the real fear hiding underneath his arrogance. He didn't fully understand the system himself, and if everyone else learned it, he would no longer be able to pretend he was the smartest person in the room. The first time Claire Holloway met Ethan Brooks, she was balancing 3 oversized blueprint tubes, a laptop bag, and the kind of stress that made her jaw ache constantly. Rain hammered against the windows of the Metropolitan Building Commission, while frustrated contractors crowded the lobby, arguing about permit delays and zoning violations. Normally, Claire handled pressure well, but that morning had been catastrophic. A contractor submitted outdated structural calculations. 2 inspection deadlines got moved without warning. And Brandon Mercer had publicly criticized Claire during a department meeting for slowing productivity with unnecessary procedural details. Unnecessary procedural details. Claire almost laughed thinking about it now. Those details were the only reason Northbridge functioned at all. She stepped toward the permit counter, exhausted, already expecting another bureaucratic nightmare. Instead, she met Ethan. Unlike the other city employees rushing paperwork through the system, Ethan actually read the submissions people handed him. Carefully, patiently. While another permit officer might glance at the cover sheet for 5 seconds, Ethan reviewed every page with quiet concentration. At first, Claire found it irritating. Then she realized something unusual. He was competent, dangerously competent. "You're missing a revised foundation approval," Ethan said calmly, while reviewing her harborfront documents. Claire frowned immediately. "No, I uploaded that yesterday." Ethan rotated the monitor slightly toward her. The file timestamp revealed the problem instantly. Someone had overwritten the revision during an internal update. Claire's stomach tightened. That should have been impossible, unless someone inside Northbridge had manually altered the submission sequence. "You caught that fast," she admitted quietly. Ethan gave a small shrug. "Most problems leave fingerprints." That sentence stayed with her long after she left the building. Over the next several months, Claire found herself volunteering for more permit submissions personally, even when assistants could have handled them. Officially, it was about efficiency. Unofficially, she wanted to see Ethan again. Their conversation started professionally. Building codes, inspection delays, historic zoning regulations. Then gradually, coffee after work, late-night takeout dinners, walks through downtown Boston after impossible deadlines. For the first time in years, Claire found herself relaxing around someone. Ethan didn't care about office politics. He didn't care about status. And unlike most men Claire had dated, he never seemed intimidated by her intelligence. In fact, he admired it. "You know what your problem is?" he teased one evening while they sat beside the harbor eating clam chowder from paper cups. Claire raised an eyebrow. "I'm almost afraid to ask." "You think competence is normal," she laughed softly. "It should be." "Exactly," Ethan replied. "But most people spend their lives pretending to know what they're doing. You actually do." Claire looked away before he could notice how much those words affected her. Because deep down, exhaustion had started replacing pride. At Northbridge, Brandon's behavior continued getting worse. He interrupted her constantly during meetings now, excluded her from executive planning sessions, forwarded her ideas to clients using his own name. Worst of all, he started undermining her authority publicly in front of employees. One afternoon, Claire walked into a conference room to discover Brandon leading a presentation using workflow models she had personally designed weeks earlier. Without crediting her once, she stood frozen near the doorway while executives congratulated Brandon for his innovative systems thinking. Brandon noticed her immediately and smiled, not kindly, triumphantly. That was the moment Claire finally understood something dangerous. Brandon Mercer wasn't merely insecure. He viewed her as a threat. Meanwhile, Ethan had begun noticing troubling patterns inside Northbridge's permit submissions. Structural modifications appeared after engineering approvals were completed. Material specifications quietly changed. Safety reinforcements vanished between revision stages. At first, Ethan assumed simple administrative mistakes. Then he started seeing Brandon Mercer's authorization signature attached repeatedly to the altered documents. The deeper Ethan looked, the worse the pattern became. Someone inside Northbridge was manipulating approved plans after review stages closed. And if those changes reached active construction sites, people could die. Ethan began quietly saving copies of every suspicious revision, every timestamp, every alteration, every approval discrepancy. He didn't tell Claire immediately, not because he doubted her, but because he was beginning to suspect something far bigger than workplace sabotage was happening inside Northbridge urban design. And he needed proof before powerful people realized he was watching. Claire should have noticed something was wrong the week before the wedding. Looking back later, the warning signs felt painfully obvious. Brandon had suddenly become polite, not genuinely polite, performative polite. He stopped interrupting her during meetings, stopped publicly criticizing her workflow procedures, stopped forwarding passive-aggressive emails to department heads questioning her efficiency. At first, Claire assumed Richard Mercer had finally stepped in behind the scenes and warned his son to behave professionally. Now she realized Brandon had simply been planning something else, something crueler. 3 days before the wedding, Northbridge held a leadership review meeting regarding the Harborfront Renewal Project, the largest urban redevelopment contract Boston had awarded in over a decade. The project was worth hundreds of millions. Failure wasn't an option. Claire arrived carrying updated compliance reports, engineering approvals, and revised construction timelines prepared inside her operational system. As usual, Brandon arrived late. Expensive navy suit, perfect hair, smug expression. He walked into the conference room like a man performing confidence rather than feeling it. Richard Mercer sat near the far end of the table, reviewing documents, while senior executives discussed permit timelines. The moment Claire began explaining updated verification procedures, Brandon interrupted. "We don't need another lecture on systems," he said casually. "What we need is execution." The room fell silent. Claire kept her voice controlled. Execution fails without accurate coordination. Brandon leaned back in his chair. Or maybe projects slow down because some people overcomplicate simple processes to make themselves indispensable. The comment hit exactly as intended. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard's eyes narrowed immediately. Brandon. But Brandon continued anyway. "All I'm saying is no company should rely so heavily on one employee that basic operations collapse without them." Claire stared at him carefully, because suddenly the sentence felt less like criticism and more like preparation. After the meeting ended, Richard quietly apologized in the hallway. "He's under pressure," he admitted tiredly. Claire forced a small smile. "I'm getting used to it." But she wasn't. The truth was, she was exhausted, not from work, from constantly defending her right to exist inside a company she had practically rebuilt herself. That night, Ethan found her sitting alone at their apartment kitchen counter, surrounded by seating charts and wedding invitations. "You okay?" he asked gently. Claire hesitated, then finally admitted the truth. "I think Brandon hates me." Ethan didn't look surprised. "He does." Claire blinked. "You knew?" "I know insecure men," Ethan replied calmly while loosening his tie. "Especially the kind raised believing respect should automatically belong to them." Claire looked down quietly. "What if he keeps making my life miserable after the wedding?" Ethan studied her for several seconds before answering carefully. "Then maybe your life is trying to move you somewhere better." At the time, Claire thought he was simply comforting her. She didn't yet realize Ethan already suspected something catastrophic was unfolding inside Northbridge. The next morning, he discovered proof. While reviewing harborfront permit revisions, Ethan found a structural reinforcement approval that had been modified after final engineering sign-off. The revised materials were significantly cheaper and dangerously weaker. Worse still, the alteration authorization came directly from Brandon Mercer's account credentials. Ethan's pulse quickened as he pulled archived versions of the submission history. The changes were intentional, systematic, and potentially criminal. If the wrong load stress hit those structures years later, sections of the development could literally fail. People could die. Ethan immediately downloaded copies of every revision trail onto an encrypted drive. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't tell Claire before the wedding. Not yet. She deserved one perfect day, untouched by corporate corruption and betrayal. So for the next 48 hours, Ethan said nothing. He smiled through rehearsal dinners, helped finalize floral arrangements, danced with Claire in their kitchen while she practiced vows she kept pretending not to cry through. And all the while, Northbridge unknowingly moved closer toward disaster. Then came the wedding day, the cathedral, the vows, the kiss, and finally, Brandon Mercer's text message. "You're fired. Consider it my wedding gift to you." Standing inside the cathedral hallway, with Claire trembling beside him, Ethan understood instantly what Brandon had just done. Not only had he fired the one person capable of operating Northbridge's entire internal infrastructure, he had done it while under active investigation without even realizing it, which meant when the collapse started, Claire would be completely outside the blast radius, and Brandon would have nobody left to save him. Claire barely touched her phone during the flight to Maui. Even after leaving Boston behind, the notifications continued flooding the screen every few minutes. Voicemails, emails, emergency meeting requests. By the time the plane landed in Hawaii, Richard Mercer had already called 23 times. Claire stared at the phone while passengers slowly exited around them. Part of her wanted to answer, not because she missed Northbridge, but because responsibility had been wired into her so deeply that ignoring a collapsing project felt physically wrong. Ethan noticed immediately. "You're thinking about calling him back." Claire sighed quietly. "The Harborfront submission deadline is Monday. If the system crashes completely—" "Claire," Ethan interrupted gently, "you were fired." The words landed harder than she expected, not because they hurt, because they were true. For years, Claire had treated Northbridge like family. She sacrificed weekends, holidays, relationships, and sleep, believing loyalty would eventually be valued. Instead, Brandon had terminated her by text message between wedding photographs. Ethan slid his hand into hers as they walked through the open-air airport beneath swaying palm trees. You don't owe people loyalty after they weaponize it against you. For the first time since the wedding, Claire allowed herself to stop feeling guilty. Their resort overlooked the Pacific Ocean, hidden along a quiet stretch of Maui coastline where lava rock cliffs met endless blue water. It should have felt impossible to relax while her career imploded back home, but strangely, it didn't. For the first 2 days, Claire ignored every message completely. She swam in the ocean with Ethan, drank coffee watching the sunrise from their balcony, fell asleep listening to waves instead of Slack notifications and emergency conference calls. Meanwhile, Northbridge descended into chaos. On the third morning, Claire finally listened to Richard's newest voicemail, while Ethan ordered breakfast downstairs. His voice sounded exhausted. "Claire, please. Nobody can locate the revised engineering approvals. The Harborfront contractors are threatening legal action, and Brandon can't access the workflow permissions. We need your help." Need your help. Not, "We're sorry." Not, "You deserved better." Need. Claire deleted the voicemail. An hour later, another arrived. This time, Richard offered to triple her salary. She deleted that one too. Then came the next offer. Executive authority, profit sharing, partial ownership. Each voicemail grew more desperate than the last, and with every message, Claire slowly began understanding something important. Richard Mercer still viewed her as a solution, not a person. That realization hurt more than Brandon's cruelty ever had, because Richard had known her value for years. He had praised her constantly, trusted her judgment, relied on her systems. Yet when Brandon undermined her publicly, Richard allowed it. When training sessions got canceled, Richard stayed silent. When Claire's authority eroded inside the company she built, Richard watched it happen. Now Northbridge was collapsing because the very knowledge Brandon tried to suppress had disappeared with her. Late that evening, Ethan found Claire sitting alone beside the shoreline, staring at the dark horizon. "You listened to the voicemails again," he said quietly. Claire nodded. "They're panicking." "They should be." She looked up at him carefully. "You still haven't told me everything, have you?" Ethan hesitated, then sat beside her in the sand. "The Harborfront plans Brandon submitted," he began slowly. "They weren't just sloppy. Claire's chest tightened immediately. What do you mean? Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. I copied the revision histories before the wedding. Claire stared at him. Revision histories? There were unauthorized structural changes after engineering approvals closed. Reinforcement materials got downgraded. Safety features disappeared from revised plans. The blood drained from Claire's face. That's impossible. The engineering department would never approve those modifications. They didn't, Ethan replied quietly. That's the problem. For several seconds, the ocean seemed to disappear beneath the roar suddenly filling Claire's ears. Brandon hadn't simply sabotaged her career. He had manipulated active construction documents tied to public infrastructure. People could have died. Claire looked back toward the crashing waves, trying to steady her breathing. Everything changed in that moment. This was no longer office politics, no longer revenge, no longer about humiliation. This was corruption, real corruption. And suddenly, Brandon Mercer's panic made perfect sense. Because while Northbridge struggled desperately to regain access to Claire's system, they still had no idea a far more dangerous collapse was already coming for them. Claire didn't sleep that night. Long after Ethan fell asleep beside her in the resort suite, she sat alone on the balcony, overlooking the black Pacific Ocean, replaying everything in her mind. The canceled training sessions, the altered permit files, Brandon's growing hostility, Richard's silence. Every piece suddenly fit together with terrifying clarity. For months, Brandon Mercer had been quietly manipulating the Harborfront project behind the scenes, while simultaneously making sure nobody else learned the operational system well enough to detect it. And Claire had unknowingly protected him. Her system was so efficient, so streamlined, that it helped conceal irregularities faster than traditional workflows would have. The realization made her feel sick. By sunrise, she had stopped thinking like a former employee entirely. Now she was thinking like someone who needed to fix an entire broken industry. Ethan found her still awake when dawn painted the horizon gold. "You haven't slept at all, have you?" he asked gently. Claire shook her head. Then she looked directly at him. "What if this isn't the end of my career?" Ethan sat beside her quietly. "What if it's the beginning of the right one?" For the first time since the wedding, Claire smiled, a real smile, not forced, not exhausted, certain. Back in Boston, Northbridge urban design was unraveling rapidly. Without Claire's system knowledge, departments couldn't track approval chains properly. Contractors received outdated blueprints. Internal communication collapsed into confusion. Entire sections of the Harborfront projects stalled because nobody understood how the automated verification sequences worked. Executives blamed each other daily. Clients panicked. And Brandon Mercer was drowning. Richard Mercer called twice more that morning. Claire ignored both. Instead, she opened her laptop beside the ocean and started writing. Business structure, service categories, regulatory oversight models, compliance verification systems. By the time Ethan returned from breakfast, Claire had already drafted the foundation for a new company, Summit Compliance Group. Its mission was simple: protect cities from exactly the kind of corruption that had infected Northbridge. When they returned to Boston 4 days later, Claire moved faster than anyone expected. Within 72 hours, the company was legally registered. Office space was leased downtown. A website launched, and initial proposals were submitted to municipal planning departments across Massachusetts. Most shocking of all? The Riverside Urban Planning Authority responded almost immediately. Apparently, rumors about the Harborfront situation were already spreading through regulatory circles, and Claire Holloway's name carried weight. A week later, Ethan officially submitted his evidence package regarding the altered Harborfront files. The investigation detonated across the city like a bomb. Auditors discovered unauthorized structural modifications, reduced reinforcement specifications, missing engineering approvals, and falsified revision histories connected directly to Brandon Mercer's authorization credentials. The Harborfront project was frozen instantly. News stations camped outside Northbridge Tower around the clock. One headline dominated local media: Major Boston development under investigation for safety violations. Brandon Mercer disappeared from public view almost overnight. Richard Mercer issued emergency statements promising cooperation. And suddenly, everyone who once ignored Claire Holloway wanted access to her expertise. Her phone exploded with calls from developers, city officials, engineering firms, legal consultants. But Claire noticed something interesting. Nobody pitied her anymore. They respected her because the city now understood something Brandon never had. Claire wasn't replaceable. She was foundational. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes inside Summit's temporary office space, Claire finally answered a call from Richard Mercer. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Richard exhaled heavily. "You knew this would happen." Claire's voice remained calm. "No, I knew your company was vulnerable. I didn't know the extent of Brandon's actions until recently." Richard sounded older somehow, smaller. "The board suspended him this morning." Claire closed her eyes briefly, not because she felt satisfaction, because despite everything, hearing it still hurt. Richard continued quietly. "The Harborfront investors are threatening lawsuits. Contractors are pulling out. We may lose the entire company." Claire stared out the office window toward Boston Harbor. Months ago, those words would have terrified her. Now they simply felt distant. "I'm sorry, Richard," she said honestly, "but Northbridge made its choices long before my wedding day." Silence filled the line. Finally, Richard spoke again. "I should have protected you." Claire swallowed hard. Yes, he should have, but some realizations arrive too late to save what's already broken. After ending the call, Claire looked around her unfinished office, filled with unopened boxes, folding chairs, and handwritten plans scattered across tables. It wasn't polished yet. It wasn't powerful yet. But for the first time in years, everything she was building finally belonged to her. Exactly 1 year after Claire Holloway walked out of St. Augustine Cathedral with 214 missed calls on her phone, a cream-colored envelope arrived at Summit Compliance Group. No company logo, no return address, just her name written neatly across the front in dark blue ink. Claire stared at it for several seconds before opening it, because somehow she already knew who sent it. Inside was a handwritten letter, not typed, not dictated by attorneys or assistants. Handwritten. Richard Mercer's signature sat at the bottom of the final page. Claire slowly lowered herself into the chair behind her office desk and began reading. "Dear Claire, some failures destroy companies. Others reveal the failures already inside them. What happened at Northbridge was not caused solely by Brandon's arrogance. It was caused by my weakness as a leader and my refusal to confront problems before they became disasters. I failed you long before your wedding day." Claire stopped reading for a moment. Outside her office windows, Boston Harbor shimmered beneath pale autumn sunlight, while employees moved through Summit headquarters carrying project files and compliance reports. Her company had grown far beyond the tiny office she started 1 year earlier. Summit now advised 3 municipal governments. 22 employees worked under her leadership. Universities had begun studying her verification systems as models for ethical infrastructure oversight. And yet, seeing Richard's handwriting still stirred something complicated inside her chest. She continued reading. Northbridge, according to the letter, had spent the last year rebuilding itself almost entirely from scratch. New compliance departments, independent engineering audits, mandatory ethics reviews, transparent revision tracking. Most surprising of all, Brandon Mercer was still there, not as an executive, not as leadership, as a junior coordinator working under strict supervision. Richard explained that Brandon had completed professional ethics retraining and voluntarily accepted demotion rather than leaving the industry entirely. Then came the line that made Claire pause again. He says, "Losing your respect was the moment he finally understood the kind of man he had become." Claire leaned back slowly. She wasn't sure what emotion she felt. Certainly not forgiveness, but not satisfaction either. The truth was more uncomfortable. Part of her had expected Brandon to self-destruct completely after the investigation. Instead, according to Richard, he had stayed, taken responsibility, accepted humiliation, started over. The final page contained a request. Richard wanted Claire to visit Northbridge Tower and independently evaluate the company's rebuilt compliance systems, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, as an outside authority. Claire read the final paragraph twice. "I understand if you refuse. Some bridges remain ash forever. But if genuine accountability matters, then perhaps you should witness whether change is truly possible. With respect, Richard Mercer." That evening, Claire showed the letter to Ethan while they ate dinner inside their renovated Beacon Hill townhouse. Ethan read silently before placing the pages carefully back on the table. "What do you think?" Claire asked quietly. Ethan studied her face instead of the letter. "I think you already know the answer." Claire sighed. "I don't know if I'm angry anymore. That's not the same thing as trust." "No," she admitted softly. "It isn't." For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan finally asked the question she'd been avoiding herself. "If you go back there, what are you hoping to find?" Claire looked down at the letter again. Closure? Validation? Proof people could actually change. Maybe all three. A week later, Claire walked through the glass entrance of Northbridge Tower for the first time since her wedding day. The moment felt surreal. The lobby looked different immediately. New reception staff, updated security systems, digital compliance screens displayed openly near workstations. Transparency. Visible transparency. Employees moved through the building with an energy that felt unfamiliar compared to the tense atmosphere Northbridge once carried. No whispered panic, no fragile egos dominating conference rooms, just work. Claire followed an assistant down the hallway toward the executive conference suite. Her heels echoed sharply against polished floors she once crossed daily, while carrying impossible responsibilities no one fully acknowledged. When the conference room doors opened, Richard Mercer stood waiting beside the windows overlooking downtown Boston. But he wasn't alone. Brandon Mercer sat quietly at the far end of the table. The moment Claire saw him, she nearly stopped walking, because the man sitting there barely resembled the arrogant executive who had fired her by text message 1 year earlier. The expensive confidence was gone. So was the smugness. Brandon looked thinner, older somehow, not physically, emotionally, and for the first time since Claire met him, he looked genuinely ashamed. For several long seconds after Claire entered the conference room, nobody spoke. Boston's skyline stretched behind the glass walls, while late afternoon sunlight reflected across polished steel and marble surfaces. A year ago, Claire would have walked into this room carrying project binders and impossible deadlines, while Brandon Mercer searched for ways to undermine her. Now she walked in as the most respected compliance consultant in the state, and everyone in the room knew it. Richard Mercer recovered first. "Thank you for coming, Claire." His voice sounded quieter than she remembered, less commanding. Claire gave a polite nod before taking the seat across from them. Brandon still hadn't looked directly at her. The silence grew uncomfortable. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I know no apology can erase what happened." "No," Claire replied calmly. "It can't." Richard accepted the answer without argument. "That's fair." Then, unexpectedly, Brandon stood. The movement startled Claire slightly. For a moment, He simply remained there with both hands braced against the conference table, like he needed the support to steady himself. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked every trace of arrogance she once hated. "I owe you more than an apology." Claire said nothing. Brandon swallowed hard before continuing. "What I did to you was cruel, unprofessional, vindictive." He forced himself to meet her eyes. "And dangerous." The last word lingered heavily in the room. Dangerous. Not embarrassing. Not petty. Dangerous. Because they all understood now how close the Harborfront project had come to becoming a catastrophe. Brandon exhaled shakily. "I spent most of my life believing respect should automatically belong to me because of my last name. And every time people respected you instead..." His jaw tightened. "I hated you for it." Claire watched him carefully, not because she trusted him, because she was trying to decide whether this was performance or truth. Brandon continued quietly. "When you built systems I couldn't understand, I felt threatened. When my father trusted your judgment over mine, I felt humiliated. And instead of becoming better," he looked down briefly, "I tried to destroy you." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, as though hearing the confession still physically hurt him. Claire remained perfectly still, because strangely enough, she already knew all of this. Not the words, but the insecurity underneath them. She had seen it years earlier. Brandon finally sat back down, slowly. Then Richard slid a thick folder across the table. "We rebuilt everything," he said. Claire opened it carefully. Inside were independent audit reports, compliance restructuring plans, engineering oversight procedures, mandatory ethics certifications, and fully redesigned verification systems. Every weakness that once existed inside Northbridge had been dissected and rebuilt under external review. Claire flipped through the documents slowly, unable to hide a flicker of professional respect. The systems were thorough, very thorough, Richard noticed immediately. "We modeled much of it after Summit's public compliance framework." Claire almost smiled at that. Of course they had, because now the entire industry followed standards she created. Then Brandon reached beside his chair and placed something small onto the table between them. A silver USB drive. Claire stared at it instantly. "I recovered everything connected to your original system," Brandon explained quietly. "Every archived sequence, every authorization layer, every protected file." His voice softened further. "It belongs to you." Claire picked up the drive slowly between her fingers. 2 years of her life once lived inside that system. Long nights, sacrifices, innovation, stress, and eventually, betrayal. Before she could respond, Richard slid a second item toward her. A check. Claire glanced down at the amount and froze. Every dollar spent on her wedding, down to the exact cent. Her eyes lifted sharply. "How did you even get this number?" For the first time, Brandon gave the faintest hint of embarrassed humor. "Your wedding planner's assistant dated one of our contractors." Claire almost laughed despite herself. Almost. Richard leaned forward carefully. "We know money doesn't fix what happened. This isn't compensation." He paused. "It's acknowledgement." Claire stared down at the untouched check. 1 year ago, she would have dreamed about seeing Brandon humiliated like this. Now that moment had finally arrived, and it felt strangely empty, because revenge had already happened long ago. Not when Northbridge collapsed, not when Brandon lost his position, but when Claire built a life so successful that she no longer needed their downfall to validate her worth. She slowly closed the folder. "You asked me here to review your systems," she said calmly, "not to revisit the past." Richard nodded immediately. "Yes." Claire leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. "Then here's my professional opinion." Her eyes moved between both men. "Northbridge doesn't need image repair. It needs structural accountability permanently embedded into leadership. Richard frowned slightly. Meaning? Claire met his gaze evenly. You don't need consultants. She paused. You need oversight from people willing to challenge you when you're wrong. And for the first time in Northbridge history, Richard Mercer looked genuinely ready to listen. Claire left Northbridge Tower expecting to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt unsettled. Cold wind swept through downtown Boston as she crossed the street toward the parking garage, the silver USB drive still sitting heavily inside her coat pocket. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement while commuters rushed past beneath glowing office windows. A year ago, she had dreamed about this moment. Brandon Mercer humbled. Richard Mercer apologizing. Northbridge forced to admit she had been right all along. So why didn't victory feel satisfying? That question followed her all the way home. Ethan found Claire standing silently beside the kitchen counter later that evening, absently turning the USB drive between her fingers. "How did it go?" he asked carefully. Claire gave a humorless laugh. "I think Brandon actually changed." Ethan didn't look surprised. "That bothers you?" "It confuses me." She finally looked up at him. "I wanted accountability. I wanted consequences. But now..." She struggled for the right words. "Now I'm realizing I don't actually want them destroyed." Ethan leaned against the counter thoughtfully. "Maybe because destruction is easy." Claire frowned slightly. "And rebuilding isn't?" "No," Ethan said softly. "Rebuilding requires people to stay honest long after humiliation stops being painful." His words stayed with her. 3 days later, Boston's development industry exploded again. This time, the scandal didn't involve Northbridge. It involved the massive corporation that had replaced them after the Harborfront investigation. Federal investigators uncovered bribery allegations tied to expedited permit approvals and hidden structural deficiencies within multiple projects across the city. News channels called it the second major infrastructure scandal to shake Boston in under 2 years. The Harborfront renewal project immediately fell into limbo again. Construction paused. Investors panicked. City officials scrambled desperately for alternatives. And suddenly, one uncomfortable reality became obvious to everyone. Very few firms now possessed enough public credibility to safely take over the project. By noon, Claire received 3 calls from city officials. By evening, Richard Mercer called personally. This time, Claire answered immediately. "We need to talk," Richard said. "We do," Claire agreed calmly. An hour later, they sat across from each other inside a private conference room at Summit Compliance Group headquarters. Not Northbridge. Summit. That detail mattered. Richard looked exhausted again, but there was something different about him now. Less pride, more caution. "The city's considering reopening Harborfront bidding," he explained. "If we move quickly, Northbridge could regain the contract." Claire folded her hands calmly. "You mean if I move quickly?" Richard didn't argue. "No," he admitted quietly. "I mean if we work together." Claire studied him carefully. Months earlier, those words would have sounded manipulative. Now they sounded practical, because despite everything that happened, Northbridge still had extraordinary architects and engineering teams. Their collapse came from failed leadership, not lack of talent, and Summit Compliance Group had become the gold standard for oversight and accountability. Separately, both companies had strengths. Together, they could redefine the entire industry. Claire leaned back thoughtfully. "I won't work for Northbridge. I know. I won't report to Brandon. You won't. And I won't allow compliance oversight to become symbolic theater while executives ignore it behind closed doors." Richard nodded immediately. "Agreed." Claire remained silent several seconds longer before speaking again. "Then here's my proposal." Richard straightened slightly. "Northbridge handles architecture, engineering, and construction management. Summit independently controls compliance, auditing, verification, and public reporting. Richard frowned slightly. You want separate authority structures? I want accountability that survives leadership egos. The words hit hard, because both of them understood exactly why such systems mattered now. Claire continued calmly. No executive, not even you, can override compliance findings without public documentation. Every engineering revision gets triple verification. Every contractor change gets tracked transparently. Richard stared at her carefully. You've already thought this through. Claire almost smiled. I started thinking about it the day Brandon fired me. For the first time in the meeting, Richard laughed quietly, not arrogantly, respectfully. Then his expression turned serious again. The board will never agree to giving external oversight that much authority. Claire stood slowly from her chair. Then Harborfront doesn't get rebuilt by us. Richard watched her reach for the conference room door. Claire. She paused. What happens to Brandon in this arrangement? Claire considered the question carefully before answering. He starts over. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. As what? Claire finally turned back toward him. As someone who earns respect instead of inheriting it. Then she walked out of the room, leaving Richard Mercer alone with the realization that the future of Northbridge urban design no longer depended on his last name. It depended entirely on whether he was finally willing to surrender control to the woman his company once tried to destroy. 23 hours later, Richard Mercer called back. Claire was still inside Summit Compliance Group's headquarters reviewing municipal inspection reports when her phone buzzed across the conference table. She already knew what the answer would be before she picked up. The board approved your proposal, Richard said without preamble. Claire leaned back slowly in her chair. That was faster than I expected. They didn't have much choice. For the first time in years, Boston City Council had leverage over the development industry. After two major corruption scandals back-to-back, public trust had collapsed completely. Investors demanded transparency. Regulators demanded oversight. Community leaders demanded accountability. And Summit Compliance Group had become the only organization everyone trusted. Claire glanced through the glass walls of her office, where analysts reviewed structural compliance data beneath giant digital verification screens displaying live project audits. Everything she built now represented the exact opposite of what Northbridge used to be. Hidden systems no longer protected power. They exposed it. When do we begin? Claire asked calmly. Richard exhaled slowly. The city wants updated harborfront proposals within 2 weeks. Claire nodded once. Then we move immediately. The new partnership announcement stunned Boston's business community. Headlines exploded across financial papers and architecture journals nationwide. Former employee returns to oversee company that fired her. Summit Compliance and Northbridge launch industry-first accountability partnership. Boston Harbor Project relaunches under independent ethical oversight. Some people called Claire brilliant. Others called her reckless. A few quietly suggested she was foolish for helping rebuild the company that once humiliated her. But none of those people understood the truth. Claire wasn't rebuilding Northbridge for Richard or for Brandon. She was rebuilding the system itself. And this time, she controlled the rules. The Harborfront project restarted under entirely new operational standards. Every engineering revision required independent approval through Summit. Every contractor payment triggered compliance verification. Every structural modification became publicly traceable through digital audit logs accessible to city regulators. Transparency stopped being optional. Meanwhile, Brandon Mercer officially returned to the project, not as leadership, as junior project coordinator, 5 levels below the executive position he once abused. Claire's conditions had been absolute. Brandon answered to site managers. Every report he touched received triple verification. He completed mandatory compliance training designed by Summit itself. To everyone's surprise, Brandon accepted every condition without complaint. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, employees watched him carefully, expecting arrogance to resurface eventually. Many still remembered the old Brandon, the entitlement, the temper, the constant need to dominate rooms he didn't understand. But slowly, something changed. He arrived before sunrise for inspections, stayed late organizing revision logs, asked engineers questions instead of pretending to know answers. Most shocking of all, he listened. One freezing November morning, Claire arrived at the harborfront construction site before 6 a.m., expecting empty scaffolding and silent cranes. Instead, she found Brandon alone near the concrete reinforcement staging area, reviewing specification sheets beneath portable floodlights. For several seconds, he didn't notice her standing there. He looked tired, not lazy tired, earned tired. Finally, Brandon glanced up and froze slightly. "Claire." She walked closer, slowly. "You know site engineers already checked those reinforcement specs yesterday." "I know," he replied quietly. "I wanted to verify them myself." Claire crossed her arms. "Why?" Brandon looked back toward the steel framework rising against the dark harbor skyline. "Because last time," he swallowed hard. "Last time, I signed things I didn't fully understand." The honesty caught her off guard. Cold wind swept across the construction site while workers slowly began arriving in the distance. Brandon stared down at the paperwork in his hands. "I keep thinking about that text message," he admitted suddenly. Claire's expression hardened slightly. "The wedding day, the firing, the humiliation." Brandon gave a bitter laugh at himself. "I thought firing you would finally make me feel powerful." He shook his head slowly. "Instead, it exposed how weak I really was." Claire said nothing, because for the first time since meeting him, she believed he meant it. Brandon looked up carefully. "You know what the worst part was after everything collapsed?" Claire remained silent. "It wasn't losing my title." His voice lowered further. "It was realizing you would have taught me everything if I just admitted I needed help." The words hit harder than Claire expected, because deep down, he was right. Before jealousy poisoned everything, she would have helped him willingly. Brandon looked away toward the harbor again. "I spent years trying to inherit respect," he said quietly. "You built yours." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire finally stepped beside him and looked down at the engineering documents. "Your verification sequence is out of order," she said calmly. Brandon blinked in surprise. Claire pointed toward the structural review checklist. "You skipped secondary load distribution confirmation." For the first time in years, Brandon Mercer listened without defending himself. 2 years later, the Harborfront Renewal Project became the most celebrated urban redevelopment success Boston had seen in decades. The waterfront skyline transformed completely. Glass towers reflected across the harbor beside restored brick walkways, green public spaces, and community housing developments designed to survive for generations, instead of merely impress investors temporarily. But the real achievement wasn't architectural. It was structural trust. For the first time in the city's modern development history, every phase of a billion-dollar project had been publicly auditable from beginning to end. Every permit revision, every engineering approval, every contractor modification, transparent, trackable, accountable. Universities began teaching the Summit Northbridge Partnership Model in business ethics courses nationwide. Municipal governments across the country requested consultations from Summit Compliance Group. Several states even adopted portions of Claire Holloway's oversight systems into public infrastructure policy recommendations. The woman once fired by text message, in a wedding dress, had quietly become one of the most influential compliance architects in America. And somehow, she still found the outcome surreal. One cold December evening, Claire stood near the harborfront promenade, watching workers install the final lighting systems across the waterfront plaza. Snow drifted softly through the air, while Boston Harbor shimmered beneath thousands of reflections. Ethan walked beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're staring again," he teased gently. Claire smiled faintly as he handed her one. "I still can't believe this actually worked." Ethan looked toward the skyline proudly. "It worked because you stopped trying to survive inside broken systems and started building better ones." Claire leaned quietly against the railing. Maybe that was true. For years, she thought success meant proving herself valuable enough that people would eventually treat her fairly. But real power had nothing to do with begging broken institutions for recognition. Real power came from creating systems that no longer depended on fragile egos at all. Behind them, footsteps approached across the promenade. Claire turned slightly and saw Brandon Mercer walking toward them, wearing a heavy dark overcoat with project files tucked beneath one arm. He looked completely different now. Not just calmer, grounded. The frantic arrogance that once defined him had disappeared years earlier, replaced by something much harder to fake: earned humility. "Sorry," Brandon said as he approached. The inspection team needed final signatures. Claire accepted the folder and reviewed the documents automatically. Everything was complete, perfectly organized, verified correctly. She handed the papers back. "Looks good." A small flicker of pride crossed Brandon's face at the approval. Not ego, relief. Because even after 2 years, Claire's respect still mattered to him. For a moment, the 3 of them stood silently, watching snow drift across the harbor. Finally, Brandon spoke again. "You know," he laughed softly at himself, "sometimes I still think about that text message." Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. "The firing? The stupidest decision of my life," Brandon admitted immediately. Ethan smirked into his coffee. "That's a competitive category." Brandon actually laughed. A real laugh this time. Then his expression turned serious again. "I thought humiliating you would make me feel powerful." He looked directly at Claire. "Instead, it forced me to confront everything weak about myself." Claire studied him quietly. The old Brandon would never have admitted weakness publicly. This Brandon did it without hesitation, because growth had finally replaced performance. A vibration buzzed softly from Claire's phone. She pulled it from her coat pocket and smiled faintly. A news alert headline flashed across the screen. "Harborfront Partnership wins National Infrastructure Ethics Award." Ethan leaned over her shoulder. "Well," he said lightly, "that's one way to end the year." Claire stared at the headline for several seconds. Years earlier, she imagined revenge would feel explosive. Public humiliation, corporate collapse, victory. But standing beside the harbor now, she realized the most satisfying part of her journey had never been watching Northbridge fall. It had been watching herself rise. She had transformed betrayal into leverage, humiliation into authority, loss into freedom. And in doing so, she changed far more than one company. She changed the rules themselves. Brandon glanced toward the completed skyline stretching across the water. "You know," he said quietly, "people still tell me I'm lucky you didn't destroy me when you had the chance." Claire considered that carefully. Maybe they were right. Because there absolutely had been a moment when she could have buried Northbridge permanently, crushed Brandon's future completely. Instead, she chose something harder: reconstruction, accountability, standards. Systems designed to outlive personalities and pride. Claire slipped her phone back into her pocket and looked toward the glowing harbor one final time. "No," she said softly. I didn't spare you. Brandon looked confused. Claire's eyes remained fixed on the skyline she helped rebuild. I gave you the chance to become someone worth respecting. Silence settled over the waterfront. Then slowly, Brandon nodded, because finally he understood the difference. And as snow continued falling across the city she once thought had broken her, Claire Holloway realized something beautiful about survival. The people who try to destroy you rarely expect you to rebuild something greater from the ruins they created. But sometimes that becomes the greatest victory of all.